so by now, there probably isn't anyone in this room who hasn't seen the poster with its bright white letters and its sharp red background, "Keep calm and carry on." Or we've seen a number of variations, "Keep calm and smile on," "Keep calm and rock on," and for this crowd, right, "Keep calm and study on," or even what's becoming my personal favorite, "Sod calm and get angry." But behind the popular resurgence of this British slogan, a slogan that was invented but actually never used during the Second World War, and one which didn't really become popular until 2008, 2009, lies a really important and neglected history. It's not a simple story about being calm in the face of the uncertainties and dangers of modern life. It's not that keeping calm is the antidote to everything or even possible. But it's a slogan I think we can use to understand a specific history about how the age of air power shifted the relationship between individuals and their states in ways with which we are still grappling. About 100 years ago, the First World War ushered in air raids, attacks on civilian spaces and bodies that made securing borders obsolete. In the first places that experienced air raids, such as Britain, as you can see in this 1915 photo of a Zeppelin or airship, and searchlights that were being used to identify it, this meant improvising a response to keep a population as safe as possible. What role would non-combatants play in the wars after 1918? What could states ask of their entire populations, from children to the elderly, to men and women from all walks of life? The response was the creation of civil defense, a kind of civic mobilization that tried to incorporate the message, you should keep calm in order to carry on. I didn't realize when I started to do this research that this ended up being part of my family history. I'm a historian of the First World War and of gender and war generally. When I came across accounts of women experiencing air raids during the First World War, I knew I wanted to learn more. But I was finishing my book At Home and Under Fire when, in a casual conversation with my father, I learned that my grandmother, Sarah Grayzel, had been a civil defense volunteer in Brooklyn, New York during the Second World War. So I'm wearing her pin in honor of her service and in her memory. And also you can see that there are a number of other emblems that other volunteers wore during the Second World War. They embodied the slogan of the US Civil Defense Corps, which was "Every civilian a fighter." It's a really interesting shift in what it means to understand war. And certainly the family connection made me think about my work and its legacy in a new way. Because civilian spaces and bodies have always been targets of warfare. What changed was during the First World War, new forms of technology helped turn domestic spaces into battle zones. The effect of using air power, first airships and then airplanes against civilian populations, troubled contemporaries. Public accounts of the first attacks and throughout the duration of the war condemned these as criminal acts committed by a barbaric enemy by emphasizing the kind of damage done to what were deemed the most vulnerable of victims, young, female, homes, and the ordinary people who occupied them. When serious air raids on Britain began in January of 1915, the media coverage emphasized such things as a boy killed while he lay in bed, or babies being seriously injured. At the end of May, when London experienced its first air raids, 6 people were killed, but the death that received the most attention was that of a 3-year-old girl, Elsie Lillian Leggett, who died of burns and suffocation, despite the fact that her father had rushed into a home to try to save her. In response to this new phase of waging war, the Manchester Guardian urged its readers to respond as follows, and I quote, "The true answer to every act of frightfulness is to increase our efforts to meet the enemy in the field and show ourselves unmoved in our homes." This call for civilians subject to war waged against them to be unmoved began to characterize most of the subsequent responses to the air raids as they continued. And at roughly the same time that air power was coming into its own, so too were submarine attacks. And that same spring, the Lusitania was sunk, and poison gas was unleashed on the Western Front, a chemical weapon that could not be contained just to the battlefield. There was a sense that war was now becoming one without limits, but there was no organized way to respond. There were no warnings, there were no shelters, there were no evacuation, there was simply no policy. How was the state going to ensure that the community would continue functioning despite these new threats? It improvised things. It printed signs that could tell people when it was safe to go about after an air raid, delivered, among other things, by Boy Scouts on bicycles. But by 1917, when daylight raids by airplanes began, there was a new call to issue public warnings. But in private, not everyone could agree. And there was concern about particular types of the population and how they would respond. The mayor of a London borough wrote to the Home Office on the 26th of June that year that, quote, "One has only to remember the unfortunate and prejudicial effect upon health, especially in the case of delicate women, that the general warning would undoubtedly create, for one to realize that much evil would probably result by needlessly causing disturbance." And there was a thick file of people responding to whether it was a good idea to warn people of an impending danger that may or may not materialize. What would be the effects on women? How could you get people to keep calm and carry on? And you can see the tremendous power that air raids had because of their shock of being new and, in fact, terrifying in the letters that are found throughout archives in England, including those of Edie Bennett, who was a young wife and mother living in the East End of London, married to a gunner in the Royal Field Artillery. She wrote to her husband from her perch in a home under fire, messages that convey all too well that the idea that you should stay calm was not always possible. In a series of distraught letters in July of 1917, she told him, "Oh, darling, this life is getting too terrible for words, and one's nerves cannot stand much more. When I shut my eyes, can see these huge things like great blackbirds right over us and coming all directions to London. And God help us next time, for we are absolutely beaten and no warning whatever. Baby and I stood in the passage, clenched tightly together, expecting the last of our lives, and every hour we do not know but will be our last. Don't think I have any fear, but should like once more to see you. Oh, this wicked war, will it ever end?" And in a letter not that long after, she continued in the same vein. "Life seems just one misery, night and day, and forever in fear, but I suppose we must try and keep smiling for your dear sake." There's a way in which this is a reversal of the normal order of things. She was, in some senses, in more danger with her little girl than her husband was in a war zone, a traditional war zone. It was not till the aftermath of this summer that the British government decided that it had to provide clear public warnings, along with other measures that were meant both to keep the public safe and to minimize panic. Yet while official warnings, the organization of shelters, grants of financial aid, and public symphony helped the air raid's first victims, it was clear that civilians were no longer safe, that their government cannot completely defend the homeland from attack. Furthermore, and as significant, air power disrupted these divisions between a home front populated by women and children in need of protection and a battle zone filled with male warriors. Women like Bennett could absorb the message that they needed to keep smiling, but there had to be something more to do to help ordinary folks like her cope. By the end of the First World War, the age of air power had arrived, and there were some visible reminders in the immediate aftermath, such as a monument erected to the school children of Poplar, a place in East London where an infant's nursery school had been directly hit by a bomb. While the official toll of dead from this air raid are minuscule compared to the huge numbers of combatants, the millions of combatants' deaths in this war, it's not the numbers of dead that matter, but the terrifying new circumstances that surround them. Post-war air theorists and military planners argued that this way to wage war was going to succeed because of its unrelenting capacity to demoralize the enemy population and force them to collapse and sue their own governments for peace or cause these governments to just disappear. What might stop such a result was the development of what became known as civil defense. And plans for this started in many places, including Britain, in the aftermath of the First World War. In one of the first meetings, British planners determined that this was the message civilians had to hear. They must realize that they are living within the zones of active operations and therefore must expect to suffer casualties, and that the enemy people is being subjected to similar but harsher treatment that they themselves are called upon to support, and that victory will fall to the nation with the greater powers of endurance. Those actively, and to a large extent secretly, engaged in the process of planning for the next war had to determine what would allow a civilian population to endure what they construed as a devastating war that might involve incendiary bombs, high explosives, and even chemical weapons. In short, how to prepare them to face a war of annihilation. Civil defense measures became more and more public in Britain and elsewhere in an increasingly tense international context in the late 1930s. And in places like Britain that were democracies, there was heated, even vocal opposition to the very idea of civil defense. Opponents claimed that to prepare for such a war was to encourage its arrival. But what's remarkable about the transnational development is that after the First World War, it committed to relying on ordinary people to keep calm and carry on. When Britain released its first public statement about civil defense, or what it called at the time air raid precautions, it was clear that the notion that there could be no guarantee of immunity for anyone any longer was going to be the rule. One example of the public conversation that followed this idea can be found in a newspaper editorial that appeared directly responding to the release of this document. This is a reminder of the peril that hovers above. There used to be a specious phrase, civilized war. After the first bombs fell in 1914, after the first gas attack, common sense would no longer believe in it. The invention of the airplane has made war unspeakably barbarous. Women, children, the aged, the sick, the animals, all are now in the line of fire. War has less conscience today than at any other time. The war being planned for was not going to discriminate, but the fundamental question remained, how would or could an entire population respond? When these proposals became enshrined in legislation, again in Britain, which took 2 years to achieve in 1937, parliamentary debates about the passage of this legislation involved the following statement. The new factor of terror from the air means that, as in all war, it is the spirit of the people that in the last resort makes victory possible. In practice, the British government, as did, again, countries across the world, they began to recruit an army of volunteers for civil defense, creating, among other things, the key role of a warden, an individual with responsibilities that linked the state and the home, that looked after a post or a neighborhood, that were trying to make themselves take responsibility for their larger and local communities. And there's perhaps no better sign of just how open this was than Britain's Women's Voluntary Service for Civil Defense's Housewives Unit, which encouraged ordinary wives and mothers to work part-time, and they were to hang this sign in their windows so people knew that they were trained and that you could seek help from them. It crucially recognized that wives and mothers were now frontline fighters. This is a theme reiterated from the dawn of air power, and again, the cornerstone of the US's own Civil Defense Corps, every civilian a fighter. During the Second World War, women and men across the borders of age and class and ethnicity and geography volunteered to help keep each other safer. At its core, the invention of civil defense relied upon a new relationship between the state and the individual. It insisted on the mobilization, literally, of everybody on behalf of the nation at war, and it promoted the idea that since nothing could prevent danger from reaching us, we had an obligation to keep each other safe. Keep calm and carry on only works if most of us carry on and at least some of us keep calm. While few states still practice the civil defense that we associate with the Second World War or the drills of the Cold War, the principles and means of uniting an entire population to face war or to face danger that underline its developments continue to overshadow our lives. In a post-9/11 world, all of us are vulnerable to attack, and so all of us have been enlisted in an effort to keep society safe. From the signs on public transit and in every major airport that ask us to beware of and report suspicious parcels and behavior, we live with visible reminders that even in our modern wars against terrorism and less visible non-state agents, the expectation that the ordinary man, woman, and child must calmly face risks is one of the most important legacies of this transformation. Keep calm and carry on has become a shorthand for do not live in fear, or do not let fear stop you from living. As individuals, we become deputized agents of the state, responsible as best we can for helping each other survive. This can be dual-edged. We're being taught or asked to be suspicious and attentive to danger, but this could also mean using our prejudices or bias, scapegoating people. And it's certainly easy to criticize the simplicity of telling anyone in danger to just keep calm and carry on. But the history behind this concept also means recognizing the sense of community that underlay it, that we survive by keeping more or less calm and facing our fears together, that we need a solidarity to carry on. This is not new, but it's only about 100 years old, and it's one of the First World War's most significant and forgotten legacies. Thank you.